performance of your AUG trigger, which is what we're going to cover next. The felt performance of your AUG trigger, which is what we're going to cover next. So we're going to show you next how to make the proper adjustments and assembly so that you can improve the felt performance of your trigger. We already talked about it, safety first, and the safety is the first thing to go back into stock. Before we do that, I just want to show you the safety itself and proper assembly. So right here we have the safety leaf spring. There's a little V-notch that is pointing up right now. This notch is the click-click that you feel and hear when you engage safety left to right or back onto safe. That notch is meant to click into these little grooves, not flipping you off, these little grooves on the safety catch itself, like so. They go together like that. So now you can see how they're supposed to be oriented and assembled inside the stock. To reinstall the safety, let's first check out the parts of the stock where it's actually going to interface. So on either side of the safety channel, we have this small, tiny shelf right now oriented down towards the table. Same thing on the other side. The leaf spring has two little downward-facing hooks on either side of the spring itself. Those hooks facing down are going to rest in those channels on the stock. It's not very difficult to get back in, and once it's in place, just kind of let gravity do the work and hold it there for you. So you can see how the upward facing V-notch, which creates that click-click, is now facing up, and the two hooks are facing down towards the table. It's not properly seated? Oh man, totally jacked that up. Ah, there we go. Now it's good. Yep, fully rested. Next, we're going to make sure we put the safety in the correct way. We know that for the AUG, that the white is on the right, red is on the left, white is safe, red is fire. So we're going to insert it the exact same way. With the red dot now facing this way, I'm going to point the red dot and the white dot down towards the table and push them through the channel, engaging with the spring. Sometimes you'll have to assist it by taking your finger and putting it in the channel and just kind of pushing down on the safety itself as it goes in. Of course, it's being difficult. There we go. Got it. Now we can hear the click-click. So now the safety is installed. We're going to leave it on safe so that when we install the trigger slide, it doesn't move inside of the inlet. From here, we're going to reorient the stock like this. Again, I want gravity to help me, not hinder me. Take the trigger slide and just simply drop it in. That's all it needs to do. Dropped in there, it's on safe so it can't track forward and backward. This is an extremely important part of the step. We want it on safe so that this trigger slide does not move forward or back. Make sure it's set up that way. Next, we're going to take our linkage, tongue, tail. Tongue goes in first. And in order to make sure it's all properly oriented, we want the bolt release itself to be pressed up and into the stock. So I just kind of hold it that way to force it. And I'm going to find the inlet. I can see it very clearly from my view. It is rectangular in shape and it has the same width of the major constraints of the linkage. Find that channel and let it run all the way down until it meets the trigger slide. Now that it's partially in, I can see that it's already moved into the trigger slide. Got a good view? So now it's already engaging the trigger slide. I'm going to take my trigger pack, and this is a fun part of the process. There's two ways to push this thing in. If you push the trigger pack in by the takedown tab or the housing, you run the risk of having resistance from the linkage itself engage with the sear and trip the hammer when it's inside the stock. So that's annoying because if you have to make any kind of adjustment or take this back out, you have to reassemble the AUG, charge the weapon to reset the hammer, and then you can take it back out again. Technique, take your index finger and put it on the rear face of the sear and use that to push it into the stock. That way it doesn't trip. Other technique is to take your two fingers right here, insert through the mag well, and try and press apart the sides of the linkage. so that they don't come together like that when you're putting the trigger pack in. We want them evenly spaced to engage with these sear faces. So I've got my fingers inside the mag well, causing separation. I've got my thumb pushing up on the mag release to ensure that it's not, well, that's going to properly engage with the trigger pack. And then we're going to insert it through the back. I have engagement, and now as I'm going to push the whole assembly forward, you can start to see the tongue of the trigger linkage advance forward and up into the stock. Right about here, I can tell that my trigger pack is no longer going to go in any further. What this tells me is that because I've been pushing against the sear face, that the linkage is contacting the sear. That's good. That's what we want. We don't want that linkage too far forward or too far back. We want it just right. Goldilocks would be very happy. So now we're going to take our our bolt, and put it back into the trigger slide. This whole time I've been keeping constant pressure on the rear face of that sear of the trigger pack. Never let up. So bolts in. Where's my tool? Right here. Good to go. I'll go ahead and tighten this down. As far as torque specs on here, we'll put a link in the description and a short little snippet that talks about the torque specs for this bolt on the stock AUG trigger slide for what it should be. But we want it snug. We basically want to cause that trigger slide to clamp down onto the linkage and hold it in place so that when you pull this trigger, it moves the whole assembly and engages the trigger for firing. Alright, now that we have the linkage installed to the trigger slide, we're going to test some of the slop and felt take-up in the system. This is kind of a back and forth part of the process. It takes some testing, but once you get it down and you know what you're doing, it's going to really improve the felt performance of the trigger. First part of this process is to stop pressing your finger against that sear so you don't cause bleeding or pain and stuff like that. It's not too bad. We're going to go ahead and install the takedown pin without the butt pad. It's just an extra step that we don't want to mess with right now. So I got the takedown pin in there. It's crossed all the way. I pushed it all the way through, not to where it clicks, but past that point, so that I have full bearing surfaces to keep this thing very solid inside the back of the stock. Now, this is the fun part. We're going to put the bolt carrier group in, as well as the receiver. No need for the barrel at this time. We're going to be doing some dry firing. I don't want to overcomplicate the process. So, weapon is clear. There's no magazine, no rounds. I'm going to take it off safe, functions, and then I'm going to very slowly squeeze the trigger and see if I feel any take-up. I feel no take-up whatsoever. The second I start to put any pressure on the trigger, I can feel the mainspring pushing back inside the trigger pack. That's good. We want that kind of engagement. And it fires. Reset. Too easy. Fires. So I can also feel inside the trigger right now the sponginess that is characteristic of this trigger. As you can see, I can wiggle it back and forth. It moves up and down, flexes. And when I pull on this trigger assembly, it actually tries to, the nose of the trigger slide likes to engage with the inlet in the stock and create friction. But I can absolutely tell that now that this trigger bar has been evened out and contacting both sides of the sear face, that the action is much more mechanically crisp. Feels better. So again, reset works. Fire, no problem. On safe, no movement whatsoever. There we go. So you've managed to put back together your trigger slide and your linkage, and you used a different technique from what I showed you of using the trigger pack to help press that in. Let's say you just use pliers or a piece of wood or a screwdriver or something to push the linkage forward. Let's say you put it in too far forward, or you didn't line it up properly. What might that look like? So we're going to show you. So inside the mag well of the stock, I'm going to set this nice and steady here so the camera can focus. Inside the mag well there are two inlet points on either side. And it's mirrored on both sides. So if I show you one, it's the same on the other. These inlet points are Just little cuts cut in the side of the mag well to allow that trigger linkage to pass through without touching the magazine. If these linkages are pressed too far out, like that, or not properly aligned or inside those slots, what can happen is the tips of that linkage can then touch or contact the nose of your trigger pack as you try to assemble it, and can cause the linkage to bend if you apply too much force. So don't do that. It can also cause the linkage to be pushed even further forward than what is needed for proper calibration. So this is the part of the assembly that you need to pay real close attention to, the linkage spacing in relationship to the trigger pack and how it sits inside the stock. So let's say that you mess something up, it's too far forward. How would you know? Here's what it's going to look like. So first of all, I'm going to go ahead and push those two sides of the linkage back into either side of the stock. I'm just going to take my fingers and just separate, get contact points on either of the linkages, and press them into the sidewall of the stock. Now I know they're properly separated and that they'll engage with the trigger pack properly. Now I'm going to take the trigger pack and insert it in the rear. I can see that it's past the pinhole, and I'm going to go ahead and reassemble the takedown pin. And now it's a functions check. Let's say we got everything right, or we thought we did, and we're going to go ahead and torque down the nut. Again, torquing down this nut, just good and tight. All we're doing is clamping the trigger slide to the linkage, and that locks up the entire assembly for movement. So for the function check, we're going to reassemble, or partially. Take the pins out, drop in the bolt carrier group, receiver. We'll leave the barrel out for this one. Cross, reassembled. And I can see the trigger packs in, and this is good to go. Taking it off safe, I already know that this trigger bar linkage is set too far forward, and you're going to see what that looks like. As I start to pull the trigger, there's a significant amount of take up before I actually feel sear engagement. So I don't know if you can see that. That forward and back, and you can hear the click engagement. That click sound is the two ends or the tail of the linkage finally making contact with the sear face. That trigger bar is set too far forward. So I could continue with the functions check. It still works, it's just sloppy, which is something people complain about. Still resets, still sloppy. So we don't want it to be that. We don't want to settle for that. So we're going to go ahead and disassemble. Out she goes. Bolt carrier group. And this part of the process is very straightforward. All we're going to do is try and bring that trigger linkage back. So to do that, we just need to slightly loosen the primary bolt. And about there. We don't have to take it all the way out, just loose. And then with the trigger pack still installed and the takedown pin fully seated, we're going to take our forceps or our pliers, and we're going to pull back on the linkage itself. If you don't have forceps or pliers, you can find an appropriately sized flathead screwdriver and engage these two lugs in the nose of the linkage. So the whole idea is, with the trigger and safety on safe, the trigger not moving in the front, and the trigger pack isolated, all we're going to do is take this trigger linkage and shift it backwards so it makes contact with the sear face. That's all we're doing. We're not trying to trip the hammer or fire the gun. We're just going to bring it back a little. So getting a good grip on it. There we go. Got it engaged. Had that shift. And again, like I told you, we have that different method where we can take a flathead screwdriver and basically press these two notches right here, just get a good bite on them, and then just push rearward on the assembly. Make sense? Good to go. All right, once we get that trigger linkage further back, now we can just tighten down our nut, and we'll do another functions check. Reassemble the gun, or partial reassembly. Cross, off safe. There's no take up, no click click, back and forth. All that clicking sound right now is just the nose of the trigger shoe itself impacting the cutlass root on the stock. So I can feel that's mechanically tight. Fire, reset, no issues, fire, reset, and there we go. So that's the adjustment if you push the trigger linkage too far forward. If the trigger linkage is too far back, well, for one, you're going to know it because you might inadvertently fire the trigger pack as you put it into the stock, and or your felt travel is going to be much shorter. That's not necessarily a good thing. We want the sear to be fully engaged on the hammer tongue before it releases and fires. So from here, we've adjusted the trigger, we fixed our mistakes, we know it's fully engaged, we know that the linkage rod ends, the tail, are both contacting the trigger pack simultaneously, just contacting, not preloading, and not too far forward. That adjustment's been taken care of. Everything's mechanically tight, as best as we can get it with stock parts. And we're going to go ahead and reassemble and do a functions check on the weapon. So, final things to do, go ahead and put the button pad back on. This is the fancy Corvus anti-rotation tab, so you got to take it out before you can get the button pad back on. Pushing down on the takedown, proper orientation, click, it's in, butt pad's on. Go ahead and lock the bolt to the rear, take our barrel, and reinstall. Midwest, boom, got it. So now she's reinstalled, off safe, fire, reset, good deal, fire, reset, on safe. Ready to go to the range and shoot. So far we've talked about how to disassemble, also take out the internal components of the AUG, and how to adjust the trigger linkage and some of the components inside to make them work better mechanically. So the end result is a better felt trigger pull. That answers one of the two major complaints about the AUG, the other being ergonomics. There are aftermarket options, however, to help improve upon both of those, and we're going to cover some of those in the next segment.
Steel at 200 with an RMR. Woo! That's pretty damn. That's awesome.